Ron Nixon, thank you very much for joining us, and congratulations on that award. That's quite a great kudo to you and your work. There's another award, we're at an award show, and there's another award I want to ask you about, which is last year's Pulitzer citation for Ida B. Wells. Right. And as a co-founder of the Ida B. Wells Society, tell me a little bit about what that means to you, and what was the Pulitzer Committee trying to say in honoring her intrepid investigative reporting about lynchings in particular?
Well, thanks for having me, first of all. I really appreciate it's an honor to be able to do this. In terms of the Pulitzer awarding Ida B. Wells, I think it is a fulfillment of the work that she did. I mean, Ida B. Wells was one of the first investigative reporters, and also, likely one of our first data reporter, because that's what she was known for. One of her seminal works is a red record, a statistical tabulation of lynching in America. So, I think that it is overdue recognition for the work that she did, because when I was growing up, I obviously heard about Ida Tarbell and Lincoln Steffens and Upton Sinclair and, all the great muckrakers. But she was rarely mentioned in that. And so I think that this is well overdue recognition. And it was also very special because it occurred the same year that one of our co-founders, Nikole Hannah-Jones, also won the Pulitzer Prize. So, great for Ida B. Wells Society all around. I don't have any, necessarily insider information on why this occurred. I am just thrilled that it did, because, as I said, she did so much work that has not gotten its due, and I'm happy that she was finally able to be recognized for her contributions to the field of investigative reporting, and particularly for people of color in the field of investigative reporting. This is not new.
Right, and it's interesting you refer to her as one of the first data journalists. I'd like to get back to that in a little bit. I'd like to ask you a little bit about your own career in journalism, and really the arc of your career is quite interesting, the various bases that you've touched and what you've become and the impact that your work has had. You didn't necessarily start out in life to be a journalist. I think you had an interest in music theory and composition, and you happened into journalism almost by accident.
Yeah, no, it was by accident, totally by accident. No, in college I was a music major. As you mentioned, I majored in music theory and composition. So my goal was to write movie and TV scores. That's what I wanted to do. I grew up in the 70s and 80s, and watching shows where Hawaii Five-O and in the 80s Miami Vice, where music, Mission Impossible, those iconic themes, and I wanted to do that. Didn't have much of an appetite to be like a singer or anything, because I can't sing. But so yeah, I got into journalism purely, by accident. To make a long story short, I happened to go to boot camp, Army boot camp, one summer to help pay for college in the National Guard. Wandered into this publishing company because I thought that they published like books, and they told me they published newspapers, and invited me back to be an intern the next year, and it kind of started from there. Well, it did start from there, and so I, 33 years later, I think it's probably what I'm supposed to do.
Yeah, I'm curious. Today, many people who go into journalism have gone to J school. They've had 5 internships before they apply to any kind of decent sized publication. Not that many people just sort of wander into this profession. Has something been lost to our profession given that change?
No, I think that, like a lot of people that I entered the field with didn't major in journalism, right? They were poli-sci majors, philosophy, math majors, what have you. And so I don't think there's anything that's necessarily been lost, because I do think that J School teaches a lot that I had to learn on my own or learn, on the job. And I don't think, like, give you a perfect example. When the first time I heard about FOIA, Freedom of Information, I was at a hearing, and this lady who's a local gadfly asked this state senator something, and he replied, and then she held up a bunch of documents. And later I asked her, like, where'd you get these documents? And she was like, well, I got them from FOIA. And I was like, who's he? Right? and so, I had no idea what FOIA is.
Right.
So, I think that those things are important to be able to teach people the craft of journalism.
Yeah, and I'm curious, how long was it before you really consider yourself an investigative reporter? A journalist for starters, and then an investigative reporter.
It took a while, because my goal was still to be a musician, and I didn't really think that this was going to be a profession that I was going to last this long in. And it really started when I was assigned to do a story, and to keep it short, ended up finding out that the police in Columbia, South Carolina, accidentally recorded themselves beating a black man.
Whoa.
And I got a copy of the videotape. And I did this story for this little weekly newspaper, and it just blew up. And, I got subpoenaed, or I got a summons from the magistrate to appear in court to tell where I got the videotape. And so, again, going back to J School, I had no idea that I wasn't supposed to, like, go and tell them. And so I was telling my editor that I got to go to court and tell him where I got the videotape from. And he was like, no, we don't do that. That's not how.
Whoa.
So he was just like, well, we go to jail to protect our sources. And I was like, jail? Dude, I don't do jail. Like, so, and at that time, I just hated the idea that this is what's going to happen to me if I did, like, a story. And they had me doing music reviews anyway. That's all I wanted to do. And I didn't really want to do this stuff.
So I think the weekly you were referring to is probably Southern Exposure. Am I right?
No, this was a Black-owned newspaper in South Carolina that was called Black News.
Oh, okay. Oh, well.
Published by South Carolina Black Media Group.
Okay.
Isaac Washington's the publisher. Yeah.
So you made your way to Southern Exposure, where you did child labor and church burning stories. You did polluters targeting minority communities. I'm wondering about that one in particular, because part of investigative journalism is about identifying structural failings in government. And did you see it at that point as an instance of structural racism, the environmental reporting that you did?
I did at first, and I had two great mentors here, Eric Bates, who's the editor, and Bob Hall, who was the founder of the magazine. And for people who are not familiar with Southern Exposure, it's similar to Mother Jones, except it's older. And it actually no longer exists, which is too bad. But I learned there. This was like my master's in investigative reporting. And that's the way that both Eric and Bob approached this, that you look at the structural failings of things, but because in order to tell people that things didn't work, you needed to understand how they're supposed to work. And so that's what I learned eventually from that. But I didn't go into it thinking that way.
Right, and then you went to Minneapolis, the Star Tribune, and for a while you were at Investigative Reporters and Editors teaching computer-assisted reporting. When did you pick up the skill set of computer-assisted reporting, which is really a specialty in investigative reporting work?
Yeah, so I started in what's, because CAR today is called data journalism. It's gone to things. And so,
I guess I'm dating myself with that question.
I actually started that back at the weekly newspaper.
Oh, wow.
I had done a story about teacher salary, and this local gadfly, this guy who, I don't know, I guess he didn't like teachers. He convinced me that teachers were not uh, overpaid, or they basically that they were overpaid. I'm sorry. And so when you looked at the trajectory of the teacher's salary, he was like, look at this. They only work like a few months out of a year. Look at this. And so, I did the story, and about 2 days after the story came out, I got a letter, and I'll never forget it. The letter said, "Hey, math boy, ever heard of adjusting for inflation?" And so I'm thinking to myself, like, nope. And so the receptionist at the newspaper taught me how to use a spreadsheet, QuatraPro. This is before Microsoft Excel.
Right.
So she taught me how to use a spreadsheet, and it grew from there.
Right.
Just using a spreadsheet to analyze. And so I would throw in like campaign contributions that I would type in, and it grew. The more I got into doing investigative reporting, the more that I saw that it was a useful tool.
Right. Did you acquire better math skills, or was it just the spreadsheets?
I did acquire better math skills after that.
I guess being called math boy might have that effect on someone.
Yes, it does have that.
Yeah. Do you find reporters these days are better at math than they used to be, or is that still a deficiency?
It's still a deficiency.
Right. It does seem to plague a lot. I'm a former business journalist, so I had to learn math. Nobody ever called me math boy, but anyhow, you made your way to the New York Times, and you had, for many years there, you had a remarkable career.
Yes.
You had a focus on Africa, a lot of reporting out of Africa. Some of the most memorable stuff I'm aware of, at least, is your reporting about the Arab Spring and the U.S. involvement in the Arab Spring. Tell us a little bit about how you happened onto that story and what you think its impact was.
So this actually came out as a result of the WikiLeaks docs. And so I was not part of the original reporting on WikiLeaks, but Dean Baquet, who's now the editor of the New York Times.
Former Chicago Tribune reporter, by the way, must be noted.
and so Dean was the bureau chief, Washington bureau chief of the New York Times, and he says, can you go through the WikiLeaks docs to see if there's things that we didn't address in the original reporting around this? And this is what I found in the cables was numerous conversations with the some of the people who led the Arab Spring in like the April 6th movement and others who had communications with the State Department and other groups, Freedom House and groups like that in the US, and the tools that they were taught that they end up using to, in their protests against Mubarak. But it seemed like the one part of the US government didn't know what the other part of the US government was doing. And that ended up being like the story, like while we're giving Egypt all of this money for defense stuff, another part of the US government is actually training people, in these tools on social media and these other things. And it created this conflict in Egypt. But the story came out of the whole WikiLeaks doc, which was a huge deal back then. I mean, nowadays it's like, people leak some documents. Okay.
Well, in fact, we've got a case here in Chicago where Mayor Lori Lightfoot's records were hacked and have been released, and local media are going to town on those findings. I'm wondering if there is any ethical concern about publishing hacked documents like that, and talk a little bit about what did you as a reporter, what did Times reporters do to validate, to authenticate those hacked documents?
Yeah, so I can speak to what I did to authenticate. I do know that before that the original stuff was published, there was this total secrecy, and the rest of us in the newsroom didn't even know about it until it appeared in the paper. So, but I know that they went through a tremendous amount of vetting. They took out names. And even when there were like situations that only a few people would know, they took that out as to not identify people. And I took the same approach, but I also called like everybody who I named in the story, and I told them like, look, if I name you, then people are going to know. Are you going to be okay with this? And it's, the New York Times international publication. So once it's out there, it's out there. And people were like, sure, we want this to be out there. There were several people that I didn't use that I did not use their names, or even on background, I didn't use their names. We took out things. There were other stuff that was in there, like phone numbers and things like that.
Right.
That we just, just because you have something doesn't mean that you need to use it all. Because again, I'm concerned about getting someone killed, or getting somebody detained or thrown in a prison. And so I took great care to make sure that people knew the risk when I was talking to them.
While we're on Africa, I want to talk a little bit about, there's a quote I saw attributed to you at one point in your career: "I don't have passion enough about any subject to write a book." But you ended up writing a book, a well-regarded book, Selling Apartheid, South Africa's Global Propaganda War. There's a couple characters in that book I'd like you to reflect on a little bit.
Sure.
Max Jurgen, who returned from South Africa to lobby for the rights of black South Africans with W.E.B. Du Bois, but was actually sort of an undercover, played an undercover role.
So Max Jurgen is an African American who went to South Africa in the 30s for the YMCA. And he actually founded, you can't quite call it an anti-apartheid group because apartheid didn't officially exist until 48. But he founded this group with Paul Robeson, who some people may have heard of him.
Wow. A music major certainly would know who Paul Robeson was.
Oh, the Committee on African Affairs, which is a precursor to groups like the anti-apartheid groups that popped up in the 70s, 60s, 70s, and 80s. But I mean, he was legitimate, like against the South African government initially. But what happened is that in 19, forget the exact year, but the organization was put on the subversive list and by the U.S. government of communist affiliation. And so Paul Robeson was like, whatever, I'm gonna, here I stand, right? Like that was the name of, but Jurgen freaked out and tried to distance himself from that. But they also discovered that Jurgen was like stealing money from the organization, and he was like blackmailing the wife of one of the Vanderbilt folks, who he was, having an affair with the lady, and saying he was going to out her unless she paid him money. But he wrote it and mailed it, and so the people, Du Bois, did the audit, and they were going to go to the post office. And Jurgen beat them to the punch by going to the FBI and said, not only can I tell you about communists and the Committee on African Affairs, but I worked in South Africa, so I can tell you about all those communists there too.
Wow.
Because, Mbeki's the second black president of South Africa. His dad was taught by Max Jurgen. Nelson Mandela, Walter Sisulu, all of these people knew who Max Jurgen was. So, had he not become what he did, he probably would have been up there with, the people that we sort of revere now.
That's incredible. That's incredible. I'm going to jump a little bit forward to some more modern times for you.
Sure.
You and you mentioned Nicole Hannah-Jones and the founding of, along with Topher Sanders, right, of the Ida B. Wells Society. And I have never heard the backstory of what led you three, certainly the need for it, and you can explain the need for it a little bit, but tell me about like what sort of conversation led to the three of you deciding to undertake this really important mission of the Ida B. Wells Society.
Right. So we were at a conference in Atlanta, and just really were sitting there talking. I didn't know Nicole. I knew Topher. I'd met him once, and then Corey Johnson, who was also one of the founders of the organization too. And we were just talking amongst ourselves about the lack of people who look like us in the field of investigative reporting. And so over lunch, we were saying, well, there are organizations that exist, but that's not their primary focus. They do try to bring in people, but there's not a singular focus on getting people of color into this. So over lunch, we were like, well, since there isn't anything, why don't we do it? And so over a series of weeks, over the weekends, we drew up like ideas, and we had meetings over the phone. This is all like, just the four of us. And then, at NABJ in 2016, we talked to NABJ, and they were gracious enough to let us debut at their conference there that they had.
It's the National Association of Black Journalists.
National
right?
Association of Black Journalists. Right. But the idea there though is that when you, as I mentioned back to like Ida B. Wells, right? When you look back at the history of investigative reporting, people like Woodward and Bernstein come up if you're like sort of more modern. But then, the Lincoln Steffens and Ida Tarbell and that whole McClure's and that muckraking thing, Upton Sinclair in the jungle. That's what you're like inundated with. You don't hear about like W.B. Du Bois himself in the May 1919 issue of the Crisis magazine, basically did a WikiLeaks. He got documents leaked to him about how the Americans sent memos to the French on how Black troops were supposed to be treated. And the post office seized all the magazines. They seized like every last one of them. Or, so it has existed, but the thing is, we just didn't know the history of it. So as a result, we don't think of ourselves as going into these fields, despite people like, Dean Baquet, who was an investigative reporter.
Yeah, well, the Times itself, when she was publishing, didn't they make a reference to her as a slanderous and nasty-minded mulattress?
Mulatto, right. Yeah, and it was the New York Times that said that.
Whoa.
Right.
It shows you a little bit about how far we've come, although there's still a long way to go.
There is.
How do you feel about the progress that through the Ida B. Wells Society, which provides training for Black journalists who want to do more investigative work, become investigative reporters, how do you feel about the progress that is being made so far?
Progress as a whole, or
as a whole, but you're clearly playing an important, the society is clearly playing an important role.
Yeah, I think, look, for an organization that's less than 5 years old, I mean, we'll be 5 this summer. I think we've had a tremendous impact, and shining a spotlight on this area, a brighter spotlight on this area. Recently, we announced that we were partnering with various news organizations to do internships. The one with the New York Times has announced today, we're paying for the internships, specifically for people to be part of investigative teams. There's one at the Associated Press, there's one with McClatchy, Miami Herald, there's one with the USA Today Network. So we've got things like that. We've partnered with the City University of New York for the Ida B. Wells Scholars to give journalists of color a chance to go through and get their master's at no charge to them. Because that's one of the big impediment. You come out of school and you got this debt. You're not gonna wanna go and take a job that pays you $30,000, $40,000 a year while you gotta pay off these debts. I think we've raised awareness around the fact that, journalists of color want to do this. And also trying to take away that excuse that you hear. like, well, we can't find people. Like, well, we find people just fine. So I think all of those things combined with where we are in media now have played a significant role in trying to diversify the industry as a whole, but particularly this area of journalism, investigative journalism, because, as I've said numerous times, I am concerned about people of color being in the newsroom, but I'm just as concerned about where they are in the newsroom.
So I think it's great to get more Black journalists doing investigative work, and any diversity that can be contributed to our field is significant. What about the next step up the ladder, besides becoming great investigative reporters, becoming editors and becoming newsroom leaders like you are? What needs to be done to do better with regard to that next step?
Yeah, I think that's where we need more people, like more Means and other, people like Denise Amos out in San Diego, Mark Rochester, folks like that, Kimberly L. Kelly at the LA Times, because you need people in these decision-making roles too. But because again, I'm concerned of people being in the newsroom, but where they are in the newsroom. And that includes, like, while it's great to have reporters, you need people in these decision-making roles as well. And look, that doesn't mean that we're only gonna cover or assign stuff that has to do with race and ethnicity. I mean, I do everything. Like, I run a global operation, and so we do everything from palm oil to Chinese propaganda. But I think it does give you a different perspective, and those perspectives need to be in the upper echelons of leadership in newsrooms. And there just aren't enough of people. And also you need to groom those people to be in these positions too. And I give credit to, folks like Dean Baquet giving me the idea that I could even consider being an editor. And then, Mike Hudson, who was my predecessor here at the AP, Sally Busby, the outgoing editor of AP, incoming editor of the Washington Post, and saying, hey, you can do that. I can see you doing this. Because when I was first approached by this job, I will admit, I was reluctant to do it, because I was thinking, well, why would I want to do that? Right? But Sally texted me. I got a text message from a Sally Busby at the NABJ in Detroit, over 2 years ago. And I was like, why is this? But, she talked me into it. And so I think more of that needs to happen, and have a deliberate plan for in putting people of color in these positions, on these investigative teams, and in charge of these investigative teams, and in other areas of the newsroom too.
Right. And I think until you see what a difference it makes, it's hard to appreciate what we're missing. I was the Midwest bureau chief for Reuters for a while, and I was responsible for our coverage of the Ferguson rioting. And in that global news organization, you couldn't just cover rioting without appropriate training, et cetera. We didn't have a Black journalist who had the training who could come in and cover Ferguson.
Right.
Which, how in the world do you kind of fit in and do the kind of reporting that we're seeing journalists now, CNN, Omar Jimenez, for example, doing some great reporting, just because people can talk more readily to somebody who looks like them, et cetera.
Right.
It still remains a big problem in journalism, it seems to me, and maybe getting more people. Yeah, getting more people with unorthodox backgrounds like you is maybe another way to kind of open up the pool of talent somehow.
Right, and I think that the thing about this whole idea of diversity, equity and inclusion, is that you have to approach it. I think we need to change the way that we're approaching it, and because I was at a conference and I said that, look, I am not diversity. My mom named me Ron Nixon, right? Like that's actually my aunt. But anyway, that's a whole aside. And I'm a whole person. I'm a musician. I'm a veteran of the U.S. Marine Corps. So, when you're looking to hire people, the diversity means a lot of things, right? But people of color bring a lot of stuff to the table that you can't just say, well, they're people of color, right? So I know stuff around military affairs. I know stuff around a lot of different things, that I can bring to the table in addition to being a person of color. And so when you sit down with people, we look for people who fit, right? But you have to think that there are no unicorns. And I think one of the issues is that for journalists of color, people look for unicorns. There are no unicorns. You have to grow the person that you want.
Right.
And I know that when I was hired, even for this job, I didn't check all of the boxes. Like there's some things that I'm sure I checked off, but they gave me an opportunity. And, I hope for their sake, they think that the opportunity paid off,
So far, you're still holding down the job. So far, so
exactly.
good, right?
but that's what we have to do. Like we have to and when you sit down, really talk to people, as I mentioned, I don't know anything about urban areas. I grew up in a place with 422 people. My father, we went deer hunting and fishing, and we had horses. I'm a rural guy. But that's the other thing too. I bring that perspective to the coverage because I didn't grow up in Chicago or New York or any other big city. So when you're looking at people of color and you're looking to hire people, consider the entire person and not just the fact that, they're, Black African American or Latino or, Native, Asian American. There's a lot more to people, and you only find that out when you sit down and actually talk to them.
I want to ask a question about how your military background has informed your reporting, but before we get to that, while we're on the Ida B. Wells Society and your Nicole Hannah-Jones, I want to just ask you a question about the 1619 Project.
Sure.
And the groundbreaking work, the important work that was done there, and then the sort of the backlash that has occurred as a result of claims that things were inaccurate, although the Times, of course, has vigorously defended that project against any claims of inaccuracy or even wrong analysis. What do you think about the backlash that has occurred? What is that telling us about the way that great journalistic work has been received?
So I look, the Times has not corrected anything. They did clarify a point, which people took the Times is back. They haven't backtracked on anything. And while you do hear this issue of, well, historians have pointed this, said this and said that, historians worked on the 1619 Project. Nicole was not the only person on she conceived of it, but if you read the entire thing, there were historians working on it. There were historians who advised on the project. So, in this Twitterverse and, social media where things are instantaneous, and, I think it's Mark Twain who said that a lie is halfway around the world before the truth gets out of bed. I think it was Mark Twain, but and that's what happens here. To me, the 1619 Project is like Upton Sinclair's The Jungle. And the reason I say that is that, people who know the backstory on The Jungle, Upton Sinclair The Jungle was not done about food safety. He was trying to point out the working conditions, because he was a socialist. He was trying to point out the working conditions, right?
Right.
And, he famously said, and I'm paraphrasing here, that I aimed for people's head, but I hit them in the stomach, right? And I think that's what happened here with the goal around the 1619 Project was obviously to talk about that the history we've been given partial versions of history. George Washington cut down a cherry tree. I can't tell a lie. Those kinds of things, right? But and that when people of color are mentioned, it's like you get a little bit about slavery, and then there was a war, and then people were free. And then Martin Luther King said, I have a dream. And that's pretty much it. To me, with the 1619 Project, it was aimed for that inclusive history, but it also, I think, revealed that historians are not these sort of objective observers who only deal in fact. They have their own biases as well. And I think that, that has really come to the fore as you see this, because again, look, nothing is beyond criticism, right? Nothing. And I welcome any work, and I'm sure Nicole welcomes any criticism that you get. But when you look at some of the thing, it's clearly like personal, and it's not like, like one of the historians was saying, well, I didn't even know it was coming. Like, well, am I supposed to call you and let you know that? I mean,
right.
It's just stuff like that. So I think that again, the work stands on its own. Obviously Nicole can defend herself on that. But I do think that it has shone the light on the field of history too, and that it is not this just, and history is not static. Like things that we know today will change as we know more facts about things,
Yeah, and you've given me an opening, and I'll now deliver on the promise of circling back to your military background.
Sure.
We've lived through a very interesting, and we are living through a very interesting moment in history. And the January 6th insurrection, the AP did some sensational enterprising work on the January 6th insurrection. I was wondering if any of your military training and having an instinct for where to go to look for records about the way law enforcement and firefighters were affected. I was wondering sort of what guided your work as you assigned this fast-breaking story, and then you layer on top of it the investigative work that your team did. Tell us a little bit about how that worked and how you followed your news instincts in terms of mobilizing your group to attack that story.
Right. So, the investigative team, we're set up to do quick turnaround, middle, sort of mid and long-term investigations. And obviously for something like this, you've got to have people who can do all three. So I think the best decision I made, one of the best decisions I made in being in this job, is my first hire was a young man, James Laporta. James Laporta, like myself, is a veteran of the U.S. military. He recognized, I think it was a Proud Boy, a formation that they were using as they were moving through the crowd. He recognized that. And that became sort of the spine of our story, which is why it pays to have like vets in the newsroom, because, James did several tours in Afghanistan. And obviously, he's going to recognize things like that. So I think that was a decision about personnel, but hiring someone with a similar background, but a more recent background in the military and being able to do. And then,
Can I interrupt? Tell us a little more about having, quick turn, medium term, longer term in a situation like that. How do you deploy people sort of on all three vectors in order to get news? Yeah.
Right. So, obviously, immediately we need to find out what happened. And so I've got people like Michael Biesicker, who's based in DC, who is really good with quick turnaround. So pairing him with James and James's military knowledge and his sources, along with I forget, I'm blanking on Jake's name, but a law enforcement AP reporter who's not on the team, was a very good reporter in Texas. Having the two of them team up with the law enforcement reporter to be able to do this, but at the same time, Martha Mendoza and Juliet Linderman were filing FOIAs for the communications for all the police forces around DC to respond to and so we got a ton of stuff from that.
Which was more the mid-range kind of
More
reporting, right?
mid-range stuff, right.
Right.
And so, that's how we were able to really deploy that, because it's like we're looking at, like, we need to do this now, but what's the bigger story here? And we did, that particular story because we were able to get like a ton of documents about what was occurring, what the paramedics were saying, what the police were saying to that point. And then using James's sources in the military, we're getting information, and my own sources in the military, we were getting information about what was happening with the Pentagon.
Yeah, and meanwhile, you are running a global investigative team. Right. And during the same year, well, actually leading up to that, I guess, but there's always a lot of news going on. I think it was last year, you did this incredible series on palm oil.
Yes.
And I wanted to raise that in contrast to what we're talking about, a fast-breaking news where you're jumping in and trying to beat, there's still good competition out there, right. Even in today's diminished state of journalism. But you also undertake these stories. And palm oil, the work you did was, one of the things so impressive about it is palm oil feels in some respects like, well, we know that story, that's right. Been out there. And yet you were able to really connect the dots in terms of where the capital comes from. Right. The really memorable story about a Girl Scout in the US selling Girl Scout cookies filled with palm oil made by her counterpart on the other side of the world. Right. How do you find it as an investigative editor, how do you find something new? How do you help a reporter discover something new in a story that feels like it's been around for a long time?
Well, for a story like that, Margie Mason and Robin McDowell are veterans in this. They actually won the Pulitzer Prize in 2016 for a story that they did on slavery in the seafood industry, along with Martha Mendoza and another young lady. So Esther, who's no longer at the AP. So this is the kind of thing that they do. They take stories that are in plain sight and find ways to tell them in that, because the seafood story had been around for a while. The Guardian, a bunch of other people have written about that story. The difference here is that they found the island where the people were actually enslaved. Previously, the reporting was people who had been enslaved, and they were talking about their experiences, but Robin found the actual island where people were enslaved and people men in cages. So that was the difference there. And that turned, really tweaked it and turned the story over. The same thing with palm oil. Palm oil has been out there for like years. The effect on orangutans, the effect on the environment, some about people, but the main thing was not about the people. And so, Margie and Robin spent, 2 decades in Asia, and they were actually reporting on the Rohingya and wondering, where are these people going, and could they possibly end up enslaved on these palm oil plantations? And what they found was it was even broader than that. And to really focus in on the workers and to focus it based on the women and the sexual abuse that they face, but also the environmental dangers, the child labor, and then, as you mentioned, connecting it beyond just the palm oil plantations to everyday products that all of us use. And I've tried to purge my cabinet of this stuff, and connecting it to these big financial institutions that fund the palm oil, either directly or indirectly. So again, it's, we have this saying that finding the island, finding the thing that right. turns it from what everybody else did to the same story, but that we can advance it and we can take it further.
I'd like to ask you a couple of concluding questions. One is that at the AP, you have client news organizations all around the US and around the world who have ever shrinking news holes. Right. And you do major investigations that run thousands of words, some of them.
Right.
You really see the brunt of the decline in the business model of commercial journalism in particular.
Yes.
Tell us what that looks like from your perspective, and how does that affect the kinds of stories that are being done by investigative journalists like those at the AP?
Well, so I think that there is a decline in commercial, outlets, and obviously AP is a B2B, right? So we're not like the New York Times where you post stuff just for yourself. We're providing this to other people, and while there are shrinking news holes, what we do find is our investigations get widespread use, and that because as news organizations are less able to do this, AP can fill that void. And AP has diversified its revenue stream over the years and is still working to do that, which helps because it's a not-for-profit. So, it can tap the foundation sector for this. And so it's changing its business model ever so slightly to adjust to these new realities. But what I would say is that you are seeing the rise of, it's almost, ProPublica almost doesn't even count anymore because they've been around it seems like they've been around so long that they're just like legacy media, right?
Right.
But you are seeing more like nonprofit institutions like that, and some of them actually merging with, formal commercial outlets. So I think while there are fewer and fewer media, I think you have different media. You've got people like BuzzFeed that do an incredible amount of work, some stuff that I'm just jealous of, right? And so, you've got Axios and the way that they do theirs, which is like, it's kind of quirky, but I love it though,
So you see signs, you see some shoots coming up that you see hope for the future of investigative work.
I do. I think there is a hunger, and there always will be a hunger for investigative reporting, because again, and you're probably going to ask this, but I looked last year was our reporting led to a young man being released from prison. That is one of the most memorable events in my 33 years as a journalist, right? So it does tell you that yes, investigative reporting does matter, and that people want to see this kind of thing, and they will read it, because we have ways of tracking readership and how people reading stuff to the end, and we get good readership.
Well, and part of the Girl Scout, twinning the Girl Scout with somebody like her on the other side of the world, part of the challenge of investigative reporting is finding those telling anecdotes.
Right.
In the Burrell case that you're referencing, a young person who jailhouse snitch, et cetera, he really was railroaded by the police. And a question I wanted to ask you is that by happenstance, kind of, his episode, the episode that put him in jail for years, happened at the very same cupped foods where George Floyd met his demise.
Right.
And I wanted to ask you, years later, this happened to George Floyd. What does that tell us about the state of law enforcement as regards Black people in Minneapolis or really anywhere else in the world? What are the chances of two?
Yeah, and I think that, as I said, earlier to you, my very first investigation was a police brutality case. This was 1987, right? So, and here we are in 2021, and we're still seeing the same things. And so I think, look, I'm not a politician, and I don't know, I have no answers on how policing should be reformed or what have you. I'll leave it up to the experts on that. But what I can say is that we're continuing to see the same things that we've seen. Go back to the 60s and Watts and all of those places. And the reason that the Panthers were formed, the Black Panthers were formed, to monitor the police. So it's I think that there have been numerous attempts to, more community policing, but policing, I think, suffers in a lot of ways from the same thing that journalism does. that it lacks diversity, and a lot of those people don't live in the same communities that they policed, so they have no connections there. And I was watching this YouTube thing and from Syracuse that got a lot of play, and I can't remember exactly when it came out, but they were pointing out that most of those police officers didn't live in Syracuse. And I think you find that in a lot of these places that the police officers don't live in those communities that they police. And there's a lack of diversity there too. And as one police chief mentioned, and I forgot where he was, but he was saying that the police are called on to do stuff that's probably beyond their, but like for mental health stuff,
right,
and all of these different things that they're just not equipped to deal with.
And let me close with a question. The theme of our event tonight is a remedy for wrong, taken from the Ida B. Wells quote. And I'm wondering, given what we've just talked about with regard to policing and other issues we've talked about, palm oil and slave work, et cetera, do you see investigative journalism still serving as a remedy for wrong?
As I mentioned to you before, I think that Maya Burrell would probably still be in prison if it wasn't for Robin McDowell taking on the case. He had 2 trials, multiple appeals, and he was still in prison. And she looks into the case, examines this, tracks down witnesses that the police didn't track down. And he walks out of prison in December, 11 months after the story comes out. You look at palm oil. The United States blocked palm oil from 2 big producers from coming into the United States, coming into the country after a story runs. Right? You look at the seafood from slaves, 2,000 people freed as a result of that. And you look at, and not just us, but throughout the industry, you see reporting that's done, people are out of jail, folks aren't poisoned, dangerous products taken off, politicians resigning after wrongdoing is exposed. Take us out of the equation and imagine what happens. So I think that, look, we still have a critical role to play in society. And even sometimes people who say they don't agree with us will agree with us on things that affect them. And so this is a critical role that we continue to play, despite everything that's going on in the industry, and even despite everything that going on in the country, where you have, people are divided politically.
Ron, you sent me a kind note about the investigation we just published with the Chicago Tribune about fires in Chicago, 61 people dying over a number of years from fires in buildings that previously had been inspected, that the city just really didn't follow up and keep people safe.
Right.
Tell me, why is this kind of story important to people and the residents of the city of Chicago or people in other cities around the country?
Well, I think it's important because these are the kinds of things that sort of fall through the cracks, right? Both in terms of how cities with declining resources, they don't have inspectors to go out and do these kinds of things, whereas, we being able to, and so they're just forgotten. And by going through and looking at this, you put and also what happens too is that the media, in some cases, tend to do these things as sort of episodic. So you got one over here, you got one over there, but nobody puts a complete picture together. And I think that's what I was impressed about, by you putting all of it together to show what was happening here. And so those things are critically important because, again, a lot of time government finds out stuff from us. And, we're the ones pointing out that, there are no controls in place here, or that people are dying here. And then they react to it. So that's critical because, like, most of the time they don't. Because, again, they don't have the resources to do this. Most cities are cash strapped. They're trying to figure out where do you put resources, and things like this just don't make the cut.
And this was a collaborative project with the Chicago Tribune, the largest news organization in Chicago, with one of the smaller news organizations. We're seeing more and more of this. How important do you think partnering is to the future of enterprising and investigative journalism?
I think partnering is not just the future. Partnering is now. So many people are partnering to do, investigations, across platforms. You see the Marshall Project and they're partnering with the New York Times, or you see us partnering with Frontline, or ProPublica partnering with people. It's critically important because, again, most of us don't have the full resources to take on these massive projects, but together we can. And I think, people like ICIJ, the International Consortium for Investigative Journalism, they didn't start it, but they've pioneered partnering with people across borders and platforms, that it's a viable model. And I think that's our survival, that we can't go at it alone. There's just no way we can do that these days.
Ron, thank you very, very much. Thank you for the incredible work that you've done as a journalist, for the leadership that you've shown in our profession, for the leadership you're showing at the AP. And thank you for joining us today for our event. It's meant a lot to have you with us, and I think people will really have enjoyed the conversation you and I have just had. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you for having me, and my only regret is that we couldn't do it in person, but thank you so much for having me.
There's still hope for post-COVID times, but they're not quite here yet.
Not quite yet.
Thanks,
Thank
Ron.
you so much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.